So there should be a strong, rigorous refutation of this dispatch by this friend and associate of Mr. Gijik's, Todd McGowan. It's called, so this is a dispatch on a dispatch. It's called On the Law's Nonsense, or I think maybe simply The Law's Nonsense. And there's a picture of Mel Brooks with 3 tablets. So the first thing he says is trivially somehow questionable, which is that it's not that the thing is funny because Moses, as the lawmaker, is supposed to be all-knowing, but then we see the Wizard of Oz type of thing, like behind the curtain, he's dropping one of the tablets, and then instead of 15, there's only 10. But since we're supposed to be dealing here with received religion or received law, we have a situation parallel to that which we get a total deep analysis of, extremely refined analysis of this situation in this long text. I think it's the longest text. It is the longest text of Platon, the nomoi, or the names of the laws. Nomoi means sort of like convention, things that are supposedly due to human institutions, so specifically, and especially money and law. The received text is supposed to be based on, so McGowan's using the phrase the authority of the lawgiver, but it's supposed to be based on, in the case of the Moses issue, then of course on Hashem or Yahweh, or the whatever the I shall be as I shall be, or this spirit that Moses supposedly speaks to face as a man speaks to his friend. So which is complicated by the fact that this is then understood at least in several different ways as we go along through the millennia. So like in Maimonides has a specific Aristotelian gloss on it in his Guide to the Non-Believers or the Perplexed, but then he says another thing in his in the Mishnah Torah, and basically that Moses had this very unparalleled relationship to Yahweh that no other prophet, none of the other prophets did. But okay, so the authority is then not Moses, so we could see that. So if Moses dropped it, whatever, I think straight off that doesn't really matter, because the authority is the spirit of the burning bush or the fiery cloud or whatever, which parallels to Zeus in the cave of Minos at the foot of Mount Ida in the legend, which was traditionally held to be true in Crete. So in Crete, we had an issue where the lawmaker had to receive text, but it was received from Zeus rather than from Yahweh, and in a cave rather than on the side of a mountain. So what happens here that McGowan is leaving out is that the authority of the lawmaker is only happens once you cease to treat the god as a source of a kind of poetic inspiration. So, Zizek is speaking of the poetic military complex in this sense. So the poets are supposed to have inspiration, and then we could look at this as a kind of rhapsode, hierophany situation, like the god manifests before King Minos, or manifests before the man Moises, or whoever it is that receives the text. And it's not that they're supposed to understand it. Nobody's saying that they themselves are the authority that understand it. They're just conduit. So then in the laws we find out what happened in that tradition was that the older citizens in the Spartan or the Doric communities were the only ones who were allowed to discuss and to offer up proposals for modification of the laws. Everyone else was meant not to discuss the matter. So later when this is rationalized, the view is, like you get it in Aristotle, that if there's too much discussion about the laws and there's too much, like for instance in our own time, and too much questioning of their legitimacy, and especially if they change too often, then what happens is, for one thing, you can legislate morality, it turns out, because if the law gets in a certain way for a couple of generations, people start to grow up according to that, and then that becomes their ethos, that becomes their dwelling, and they pride themselves on following whatever rules it is. Like I hear there's a big thing in Moscow now about littering. Like people get pissed off about littering if they see it, and it goes against the ethos, just like I suppose in former times in some European countries, maybe in Germany before the war. So there's like a minor confusion there, I think, in what McGowan's saying. But then we have to understand him then to be talking about, I think, not about something like the Moses example, but rather about something like a lawmaker, in the sense that we have lawmakers only once we have philosophy. So then there's a question of the political philosophy, according to Leo Strauss, means making recommendations for lawmakers. So that means that there should be reasons given, and if there's reasons given, that means the lawmaker actually can understand what their principle is. So, like for instance, Montesquieu's principle of separation of powers, which controls the American law, although it's constantly disputed, as with this theory of executive supremacy and so forth. But it's understood. So then you have this notion of the lawmaker as, at least in the normal sense, understands that there are certain reasons. Then there's a question about how good are the reasons. The reasons could also be called arguments. But there's something which can stand there supposedly as shared ground for different people to then discuss the matter, rather than only, as it were, mutely oppose one another with arms. But supposing then we start from this point of view, that McGowan really means the lawmaker as understood as a rational lawmaker in the time when reason has come into question. So, this is a long thing, but I'll just mention that one of the old professors at UC Berkeley, who was a big student of the critical theory in Frankfurt School and things like that, Martin J, I think his name is, made an admission that, when he was like a long a tenured professor and like past 60, he said, I never understood what the earlier generation meant by reason and why it was so important. So like he was thinking of things like Lukács's book bemoaning the destruction of reason. So this is the kind of question Lacan is trying to treat already. He's taking already for granted this destruction of reason, which I understand it this way. It corresponds exactly to the prominence of the use of the phrase subjective. So we say everything is subjective, including values. And then in the common usage, when one speaks of religion, if you're, I suppose, progressive or so, then by religion you mean the values of people that have something like Christian values, or especially if it's like anti-abortion or something like that, that can be denounced as religion, like in this DeSantis thing in Florida recently. Oh, that's religion playing a role. But straightforwardly speaking, this just means that everyone thinks that values are somehow quote-unquote subjective. So they just have different values, which we could also call secular religion. So one set of values is kind of associated with Christianity, another set of values associated with some sort of political theology or some sort of progressive movement out of the Enlightenment France, or et cetera, but there's just different sets of values and they're all regarded as subjective. And this means the same thing, is that since we can't use statements, since the lawmaker can't come forward and say these and these are the basis for this regime type, such as the basis of the separation of powers, and that can never be authoritative. It's never sufficient. It's always all these questions which have been brought out in the Hart-Fuller debate and in the great legal scholar Ronald Dworkin. Those kind of questions: is there truth in interpretation, and so on. Those are in power. So I can see this in the background of this Lacanian attempt to bring in this unbewusst or unconscious has the supposedly emancipatory moment in denouncing the power of any lawmaker. So the lawmaker has been divested of any sense of really knowing, because why? Because reason has been denounced, basically. And again, a good core book on that is that Lukács book. I think Lukács was very educated, and striking contradistinction to most of the discussion we get on the subject from, or maybe it's not even just that, but it's what I was trying to get at with mentioning Martin J. It's just that he grew into a world where he understood simply spontaneously what was meant by reason, and the project of reason understood as scientific knowledge, as capable of reaching eternal verities in statements which would then apply to constitutions and so on. So that being lost, it makes sense. I think this is behind the starting point of Lacan, which McGowan elides and doesn't, in his short presentation, doesn't try to say anything about. But okay, so starting from that point of view, to give it more flesh to his little synopsis, then he says, but there's this formal category called the law, which stands apart from any particularization of laws or lawmakers. And then it's emancipatory if we would just realize that the law is devoid of all content. I don't see the particular emancipation in that, except that it points to this desire to be have this unbewusst or unconscious device of the psychoanalyst save us. So I think that one of the problems with that is that the idea of the unconscious works so long as you have some people are unconscious of something, but the psychoanalyst or some other people can see the things they're doing that they can't see themselves. Like, so somebody even with regard to deeds, but especially with speech, they may say something and not remember having said it, but other people are conscious of it. So the notion of the unconscious makes a lot of sense as long as you have some people that are conscious of the things and some people that aren't. And so ultimately the unconscious things are at least cognized by somebody. But if you introduce it, but it's easy to slide over to thinking there can really be an unconscious which nobody is conscious of. But then what does that mean? It seems to lose all content. So here it's like they're trying to say, what if the very concept of what else can you mean then except the very concept of the law would cease to be, and nobody would notice that it had gone away. So this kind of perfect crime situation or whatever. Well, okay, let's leave it at that for the moment. There are some other issues with the concept of unconscious and the way it's being sort of wielded as an instrument, and I think as a way to attempt to solve problems which ultimately it doesn't work, and it's in a way that if we thought through it more carefully we could show that the next step is to go to Heidegger, because Heidegger's already more thoroughly worked through all the problems that need to be worked through. Not to say that it's totally, it's almost like it's just it is almost like it's just totally useless to be at that level of using these, working in these sort of labyrinths where you're just trying to play the role of King Midas and turn things into gold, which ultimately are just going to be stumbling blocks for you because you haven't seen the real problem.